credit kind of thing, or? Okay, here we go. Play from the current slide. Now the question is, does she know I'm in the room yet? Ah, there she is. She finally looked at me. Okay, so this is the backup tune-up, and you can see how big I am on slides. This is like the only slide in the entire presentation, and I'm going to make this entire deck available to you online if you want. Okay, so for those of you that have never seen me speak before, it's because I've never spoken before. This is my first time ever in front of an audience, so be kind to me. I'm Sean McCown. I am from America, but I can speak the Queen's English if you like. I really can't. I am an MVP and a certified master. I started and operate MidnightDBA.com, where we have nothing but 100% free SQL videos. You can do anything you want with our videos. You can download them, burn them onto CDs, pass them out to your user groups. You can do anything with them except what? Make money, that's right. I don't make money off of them, so you can't either. I used to say you can do anything except take my name off of it and make money, but you can't leave my name on it and make money either. So it doesn't. The name is unimportant, right? I am also the principal consultant at Midnight SQL Consulting. I'm the absolute best consultant they have. There are two of us, and she doesn't mind if I say I'm the best because she always says she's the best. So. And as well, we are Minionware software as of last year. We make brilliant tools for DBAs. As a matter of fact, we give away more software than we actually sell. Most of our software is free. And you're going to get to see a little bit of Minion backup today at the end of this session because it ties in absolutely perfectly with what we're doing, which is tuning backups and tuning them at the enterprise level. So with that in mind, who wants to tune some backups? I know I do. I know she does. She's dying. Okay. So, tuning backups. It's one of those things that I have been doing for so long now. It took me a long time to get this session down to figure out how to teach it to somebody. I have been involved in large enterprises for over 20 years now, a lot of times as the only DBA or one of only 2 or 3 DBAs monitoring thousands of SQL boxes. 2,000 and 3,000 servers with tens of thousands of databases on them. And I got involved in backup tuning in the late 90s when Lightspeed came out. Back when it was started in Australia, and then it was sold to MCETA. Walter Scott, the president of MCETA, bought it, and then it exploded after that, right? And I ended up doing a bunch of QA for them. I did a bunch of the contracting for them and finding a bunch of the bugs and a bunch of the performance tests for their white papers and whatnot. And I've been involved with to some degree, in almost every single SQL backup product that there is on the market today, and a couple of them that have faded away. And I'm not talking about those crappy net backups and backup execs and stuff like that. Those aren't SQL backup tools, right? Those are generic backup tools that they've tried to force into SQL molds, and they don't work most of the time anyway, right? So what I'm going to show you today is that SQL backup actually has somewhat of an execution plan that you can follow and figure out what's taking so long for your backups. Now, it's not the same kind of execution plan that you get with a query, right? You're not going to get to see a lovely little graphical execution plan, although I have been asking for that for many years now. And they even agree that it would be a great idea, but, nobody has yet to give it to me. So you're going to be able to piece together this execution plan, and we're going to start. I actually meant to start this a minute ago, and I forgot. So, what's the phrase? Sue me. Okay, so we're going to start this restore. Yeah, see, my mouse freezes up every few seconds, so when I'm recording, so I've got to wait for it to go again. That's all right. There we go. So I'm going to start this restore while I talk the rest of the way, and it's going to take it a minute. Okay. So tuning backups. I quite often see a backup that is taking a long time, 2 hours, 3 hours, 6 hours, sometimes 12 hours. And I never really know. There's no way that I can tell you or anybody else can tell you how long your backup should take. I have no idea if your backup is running too long or not, or if it's tuned perfectly or not, right? But what I can tell you is when it's running too long. It's kind of like, have you guys ever heard the working definition of porn? Right? They always say I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. Right? So I can't define a fully tuned backup just by hearing your times. Well, I've got a database that's 2 terabytes and it takes this long to back up. I can't tell you if that's as good as you can get. But if you're backing up 2 terabytes in 6 hours, I can tell you that's definitely out of tune. Right? And so I hear this quite often where people say, I've given this session and somebody comes up to me afterwards and says, I don't care how long it takes my database to back up. What do I care if it takes 12 hours to back up my 4 terabyte database? I've got the time, so what? Well, I never really thought of it that way. You're absolutely right. I guess I'll go home. No, but if you can't tune your restores unless you tune your backup. So you may not care that your backup is tuned, but you do care if it takes 12 hours to bring your database back up, right? And, it's kind of like, I want HA for my application. I didn't even think about it until it was already written, so I didn't build any of that crap into it. But now I have to have HA, so I'm going to do it, right? No, sometimes you have to build these things into your application, right? You have to build the ability for things. If you want to be able to replicate your database, you have to make sure, at the very least, that all the tables have a primary key, right? And if you don't do that ahead of time, well, you can't have replication, period. So if you want your database to come up in any reasonable fashion, then you're going to have to tune the backup. Not to mention, even if you don't care about that, do you care about your operations? Because sure, if it takes 6 hours or 12 hours to back up your database, you can back up these days, you can back up the log while the full backup is going on. You didn't used to be able to do that, but now you can. And that's the second argument I get is, well, what do I care? I can still take log backups during that time. Sure you can. But it's not going to truncate the log afterwards until the backup is finished. So even though you may be setting that portion of the log inactive, you still can't truncate that portion yet, or it's backing it up, right? It just can't truncate it. So that entire time, that entire 6 or 12 hours, that log is sitting there growing and growing and growing and growing and growing. So if you don't care about the rest of that stuff, maybe you care about this. The point is it really behooves you, if that's a word over here, it's a word down south in Texas, if it really behooves you to back up your database as fast as you can. Now I'm going to show you a bunch of this stuff, and then I'm going to tell you to forget it because you're not going to really be able to do it. So we'll talk about that when we get there. Oh, good, it's finished. And how long did that take? About 3.5 minutes? Not as good as I thought it would be, but okay, so let's get into this. So this database took a decent amount of time to restore. It took 3.5 minutes to restore. We're going to assume that that's a long time. Understand I got to work with a lot smaller data sets, right? I can't say, okay, this took 40 minutes to restore. Is that good? Now, for the rest of this session, when I say backup, I mean backup and restore, unless I say otherwise. Cool? All right. So it took a long time for this thing to restore. Where would you guys start troubleshooting this? Storage? Okay, the storage media. Sure. And what about the storage media?
I don't know how big it is, so I don't know if 3 minutes is good or not.
We're assuming it's not.
Let's assume it's not, so I'd say that might be a slow write.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So the media, the storage may be either overtaxed, or it may be a lower level. It may be like tier 2 or tier 3, something like that, right? Okay. And let's assume that checks out. We're on tier 1. Ooh. By itself. Oh. Okay, so where would we go now?
Virtual log files.
Virtual log files. That's interesting that you would go there. You're right and wrong. You're kind of on the right track-ish. Okay, so that's the thing, is a lot of people don't ever have to do something like this, right? They don't have to restore I mean, they don't have to troubleshoot or restore, but let's take a look at this. I hope this gives me what I want. Perfect. So let's look at these trace flags first. 3004 sends this output to the log. It sends this diagnostic output to the log, okay? And you're going to see that you're going to get a little bit different output to the log than you're going to get when you send it to the client. So 3605 is what tells it to send it to the log instead of to the client, and 3604 is the data that we're interested in. And 1806, and I'm about to give it away here, 1806 is what disables instant file initialization. I'm going to say that only once, and I'm going to say IFI from now on. Everybody here know what IFI is? If you don't, raise your hand. I'll be happy to explain it. Okay, IFI. Okay, I lied. I'm going to say it 2 times. Instant file initialization. I can barely eke that out. Whenever you create a file, say you create a 5 gig file, a 10 gig file, it's going to fill that file with zeros. So it's going to write 10 gigs of physical zeros in that file. That's called zeroing out. Okay? What IFI does is it creates that 10 gig file empty and it doesn't zero it out. Okay? So by default, IFI is turned off. 2016 now we have that nice little setup flag to turn it on. But before then, you have to go in the OS and specifically turn it on. Okay? And I'm going to show you how to do that in just a minute. So what that means is this trace flag right here, 3004, if I come into the log here, I can see my zeroing information. And I can see how long it's taking to zero out these files. So let's take a look at this. I can see here that I'm starting with my log, and there's my data file. So I'm zeroing my log, and I'm zeroing my data file. And here my data file is completed zeroing at this time. So it took from here to zero out, and my log finished zeroing out here or here. It's the same timestamp, so it doesn't really matter. This is SQL 2014. Before that, you didn't really get the log zero complete. You usually got just this line here, so I was pleased to see that. And I've got this filtered by 0 so I can see only the events, because otherwise it just gets too crammed in a session, right? So I can see when my zeroing starts and stops. So you'll notice that quite a bit of the time that I've got here is spent zeroing out the data file. Well, let's take a look at how we turn on IFI. There we go, local security policy. And this is the same for all Windows boxes. That's something weird in Windows 10. It brings it up anyway eventually, but Windows 10, since I went there, gives me those little errors. Here it is. Okay. So I go to local, nope. User rights assignment. And right under here, under user rights assignment, let me collapse that one. So local policies, user rights assignment. And I go down here to perform volume maintenance tasks. The SQL service account has to have this privilege. So you add that in here, and then you're golden. But you have to restart SQL first. SQL only checks for this permission on startup. So if I were to come in here and do it now, and my SQL service is a local admin, so I'm covered. Don't run your SQL service under local admin. This is just my laptop. Okay, you're welcome to hack into it. I don't care. I say that until somebody sits back there and hacks into it one day. And so it only checks for it at startup. So when you change this, you're going to have to burp your service. Now, 1806 disables IFI so that I can show you what it looks like when you have IFI turned off. Now, when I turn it back, when I flip that bit again, when I turn this back off, IFI will be, it'll be turned back on, and everything will be nice. Now I'm going to cycle the error log again. That's going to make it easy for us to see exactly what we're interested in for this run, right? So now if I drop this database again and do the restore again, this time with IFI turned on, and that'll take just a few seconds. And here, I'm just showing you how to calculate. I was going to do this, but how to calculate how long, the percentage of time that zeroing out takes. So you can get back quite a bit of time. But that took approximately, what was it, 332, something like that, right? So we'll see if we get any better. Now, you can see if IFI is turned on your servers pretty easily by just creating a new empty database with the 3004 flag, and if you see that data file being zeroed out, then you don't have IFI turned on. That's the easiest way to tell. And we're waiting. Let me see what's next. Restore alter. Okay, cool. I see where we're going with that. This is somebody else's session. I just stole it and decided to start teaching it, so I really don't know much about the code. Okay, so I suppose while we're waiting for that, we're going to get ahead of ourselves a little bit and talk about the log file. So what you're going to notice when this comes up, oh, you know what? Do we have a, hey, look at that. There we go. Perfect. We're at 100%. We're just dotting some I's here. So now you see here that we're still waiting for, but you notice we have the log, the zeroing out for the log file, but we don't have the zeroing out for the data file because we have IFI turned on. Now, we have IFI turned on. How come we're still zeroing out the log if we're not zeroing out the data file?
You have to, don't you? Because that's where it knows the end of the log.
Exactly. It's required. It will always zero out the log. Period. It will always zero out the log. There's nothing you can do about that. Has to do with all the little recovery, timey-wimey things, right? That was for all of you Doctor Who guys. Okay, so I can't believe this thing is still tying up its loose ends. So now what we're going to do when that finishes is we're going to shrink the log so that we can at least get some of that back. So our log is like 5 or 10 gigs right now. I'm not sure exactly how big it is. And this is where the contradiction in the SQL space comes in. You see a lot of people out there. You guys let me know when that, oh good. Because when I take my glasses off, that's all just a big blur. But y'all are a big blur when they're on, so I kind of have to switch back and forth. So this is where the big contradiction comes in the SQL community. You see a lot of people out there, a lot of top-level experts saying, keep your log big, and you don't want to grow it. You want to keep it enlarged. So if you're going to use 30 gigs of log, then always keep it 30 gigs, right? Great. I'm all for that. Because why do they say you want to keep it big? Right, it's going to take the space anyway, but you want to control the VLFs, right? You don't want too many VLFs because it'll suffer performance, right? And you don't want to grow it all the time. Since it does have to be zeroed out, you don't want to grow it. When you do grow it, though, you will never, ever, ever grow it in percentage, right? Ever. You will never grow it in percentage. You'll always grow it at some fixed length. Now, the problem with that is with your recovery time, right? Let's say that I do keep a 30 gig file, or that I do keep a 50 or a 70 gig file because maybe once every couple weeks I've got a big load that pulls it out that big, and they go, well, I might as well keep it that big to keep it from growing. Okay, but what happens if you have a crash and you've got like a 1 hour uptime or a 2 hour uptime? 50 gigs zeroing out, you're going to spend a good deal of that hour, if not more, zeroing out the log file, and then you've still got 2 terabytes of data to drop on disk? Nobody ever considers that. They always make out their recovery plan, but they never ever ever consider the size of the log or anything else into consideration when they do that, right? So I've got to be up in 2 hours, but my log is 90 gigs. I don't think you're going to zero that out that fast unless you've got really super fast disks, right? And hopefully you're the only one on the box too, and you don't have any other resources being pulled. So when you're deciding how big to keep your log, take that into consideration. How long do you have to pull your database back? Because And that's another thing too. When you're making out this recovery plan and signing off on it, right? A lot of times they'll even physically make you sign your name to it. Make sure that that's not from the time the database goes down, but that's the time that you get the data file in the backup file in your hands, right? If I've got 2 hours to get the database up, that doesn't start from the time you discover the problem, or the time you request the tape, or the time the Windows guys get a hold of it. No. When they take that thing from wherever they need it, if I'm lucky, it's already on disk. If I have to pull it back from tape, then that's at least 4 hours, right? And then the time to copy it from the tape to the disk, because I can't restore it directly from tape. So that's another 2 or 3 hours. My recovery time that I signed off on starts the second I get that email that says, okay, your backup file is on disk and ready for you. That's when my time starts. And then I still can't make it because I keep a 50 or 90 gig log file? No. So keep your log files as small as you can. Sure. If you're doing a 30 gig log file because you constantly need that much space, you're constantly having big loads or something, or your log backups are constantly failing and every now and then and they're having to grow. So okay, just make that part of your plan. If they say we've got a 2 hour recovery time, you say, but we've got a 30 gig log. And they go, good for you, I need a 2 hour recovery time. And you go, it's physically impossible. Physically impossible. And they said, well, can you make the log smaller? Sure, but you were complaining about performance before. So which do you want? Do you want performance every day? Or do you want a longer recovery time when and if it ever happens? Which one of these do you want? You get to make the decision. I'm not being paid for that. I will give you what you want, but you have to decide what you want. And get it in writing. Don't let them say, okay, yeah, just do this. Or, oh, whatever you think is best. No. Because I'm going to go for the faster recovery time every time. Right? So, just keep that in mind. So now, we're going to set this thing into simple mode. Then we're going to shrink our log file. Now we're going to look at our space. And that was the minion log, so there we are. So good. Now we're down to 125 megs. That should zero out much faster. Now, I need to drop that database.
Probably wants to back up it first.
Yep. I thought I had a backup. Oh, here it is. I went too far. That's where I went right there. See, I had it in order. But yeah, while we're waiting for that, I've seen a lot of people talk about VLF performance. I've been doing this over 20 years now, and I've seen maybe a couple databases actually suffer from VLF performance. It's not as big a deal in the real world as it is academically, as they try to make it sound. I just almost never run across. In fact, I run across it so seldomly. I feel like an ass even mentioning it in sessions because it just happens so seldom, right? It's like when you have a GUID, right, and you call the new identifier function, right? Can you get duplicates? Sure, and every several billion, it's possible. I've ever heard of it, but it almost never happens, right? So it's not that kind of thing that you can count on. So to mention it as a problem is just pointless, right?
It does happen if your previous DBA has set up an automatic shrink on your productions log file every day.
The new ID happens
No,
if he shrinks the log file.
like,
Oh, the VL. Well,
the,
and it depends, doesn't it?
something like 3,000 virtual log files, and like in case of restore,
Right. So it happens if he shrunk it, and if he shrunk it wrong, and if you've got the wrong growth rate set, right? There are a confluence of forces that have to happen for you to, and if your database is busy enough for that to happen. I mean, you really have to have a pretty busy database to have VLF problems, right? I mean, you have to have a pretty busy database.
it's not that busy, but it wasn't like a percentage started off tiny, shrunk it back down to nothing every day, and it grew by 1%.
Right.
Hundreds of times.
Right. By 1%?
Yeah.
See?
Yeah.
I have seen databases with
Maybe a couple thousand or so. If I had to guess from way back then, I mean, it takes a lot of VLFs really for it to be a problem, right? And again, I've seen databases with a lot of VLFs, 500, 700, right? Didn't really have any problems from it. So, and that's the thing is do I have a lot of VLFs, and am I really suffering severe performance issues because of it? Because you still may not even be, just because you have a lot of VLFs doesn't mean that you're really having any performance problems, right? It's like, if you measure it, if you shrink it down and get your VLFs all perfect, right? You shrink it all the way down and then grow it to what it's supposed to be, and you've got a great number of VLFs, and then you measure your performance. Maybe the graph goes from here to there, right? And you're like, really? Is that significant? I mean, we're not talking about can you measure a performance difference. Is it significant, right? So that kind of thing. So okay, so we're going to turn this off. We're going to restore our database now. We're going to keep our trace flag off. And now, with any luck, we're going to restore a lot faster. And look at that. The zeroing's already completed on the log. And the rest of it now is just writing data. Because we only had to write 125 megs versus, how big was it? I don't know. I don't think we looked ahead of time. 5 or 10 gigs, I know for a fact. So that's number one. When you want to tune your database backups, and here I actually mean restores, right? I said I'd tell you the difference. Here I actually mean restores. The log file and IFI are a really big part of that. And that's just with a single file so far, right? So while we're waiting for that, and that'll come back in 39 seconds. Even that's considerable from the last time. So most of us have what we call an SLA, right? But what do we really have? An SLO, right? An SLA is a service level agreement. That's the one you sign, right? That's the one that you will actually lose your job for. But what you have in most companies is a service level objective, right? We would like to reach this, but we haven't tested it. We have no idea if we really can reach it. That's just what we'd like to reach. That's what we're going to shoot for. And you say, okay, well, why don't you give me a test box and I'll test the restores and we'll test the whole process. We don't have the money for that and we don't have the resources. We don't have the time. Well then, I'm not going to sign a paper. Don't sign a paper that locks you into an SLA that you haven't been able to test. Period. And I think it's important when they say you don't have a backup until you have a restore. Okay, sure. Why not, right? Even though I have lots of backups that I've never restored, because I come from environments with tens of thousands of databases across thousands of servers. No, I'm not testing all of those restores every day. But I do have backups. I promise you that, right? And the number of times that's come to bite me in the ass, almost none. I mean, every now and then, almost none, right? Not enough to warrant restoring all of those every single day. But on your important boxes, should you restore last night's backup every day to a test box? Maybe, maybe not. If you've got a busy database and you can't afford to take a backup in the middle of the day because of the resource contention, and you figure out that last night's backup was corrupt somehow, what are you going to do about it? Sit here and cry? You can't take a backup in the middle of the day, so you realize last night's backup was corrupt. What are you going to do about it? Are they going to stop business so you can take a new backup? No. So restoring your important backup every single day isn't going to really do anything for you practically most of the time. Do it once a week, do it every other day, do it something just so you can see if you've got problems on that disk, right? Keep track of it. But every single day, especially if it's a really big database and it may not be practical. And there may not be anything you can do about it anyway. You know what? If that happens, just roll through the logs.
If I know that yesterday's backup is corrupt, I at least save a lot of time if I need to recover.
You may save some time.
I can start at the previous backup right away instead of first trying to
Sure.
that, getting an error after 2 hours and then having to start over.
Sure. And that's assuming that the database doesn't fail while you're restoring it and you don't know that yet. Sometimes it's just not practical. But if you've got an automated process to go out there and restore that every day, sure, why not? I don't care. right? What time do I have to stop? I was hoping my room monitor would know that, but he's asleep. 20 past 4. 20 to 5. Oh my God, you're killing me. Okay. Is this clock right? 20 past 4. Okay. So an hour from now. Perfect. I'm a DBA, man. You have to use small words and very simple constant. Okay. So I don't really care what you do with your log files or how you manage this whole process, but I want you to be aware of the process, right? I want you to know that this is a problem. All right. Now, like I said, I can't really tell you, I can't tell you what a good one looks like, but I can tell you what a bad one looks like. And the first way that we're going to fix this, and probably the best way, is to use backup compression. Now, when I first started teaching this, even though this is my first session, it was SQL 2008, and R2 had just come out. And nobody was able to use, or a lot of people weren't able to use compression. So I didn't feel very good about recommending this as a solution when most people didn't have it, right? You had to have Lightspeed or Redgate's tool or one of the other ones, right? You had to have something like that did compression for you. And, in 08, compression was only available for enterprise, and most people didn't have enterprise across their entire shop. So I didn't really feel, comfortable saying, well, the only way to do this is with compression. But now most people at least have R2, and so I feel fairly comfortable saying that that compression is the way to go when it comes to lessening your backup time, because simply you're writing a lot less data. Now, I've had guys come to me and say, well, I've noticed that when I do that, it takes the entire size of the database and puts it in a backup file, and then it shrinks it down after that. And that's not what happens at all. What they do is they calculate how big it's going to, they calculate how big the data file they think they're going to need, right, for a full backup, and they write a backup file approximately a third of that size. And then they grow it after that in increments if they need it to be bigger. Okay, so they may have seen that they got a lot more compression than they thought they would. So they may have seen a file a third of the size of the database that then got shrunk down afterwards because it compressed a lot better than they thought. But they didn't see the full 2 or 4 terabytes of database shrink down to 200 gigs, right? So, but yeah, flat out, you're writing less data, it's going to go faster, period. A little bit higher CPU, but that's not really that big of a deal. Number 2, the next biggest thing you're going to get is with striping. So I say 2 disk equals, 2 disk equals. I'm going to back this database up a lot faster than I did before. Let's go ahead and do 5. Bam. So while we're doing that, everybody know what init and format are for? Init stands for initialize, and that means overwrite the data. But the funny thing about overwriting the data in the file is it doesn't overwrite the header. And there's a big difference between and now look at that. That backed up in 20 seconds. That's not bad, right? So there's a big difference between overwriting the data and overwriting the header, because the header has all of the media family information in there, right? So let's say that you're backing up to a single file. And so I back this database up to a single file, and I don't reformat it, and then I want to switch to 2 files. It's going to fail because the media family for that header was formatted for 2 files instead of 1 file. So this one overwrites the data, this one overwrites the header. So if I were to take this exact same thing, now let me do it this way and do that without the format and do it to only 1 file, it'll fail because it said the media loaded will support 2 media families, right? However, if I did this again with the format, then it would reformat it for 1 media family right? And I could do it to the one file now. And if I tried to turn around and do it with 2 files without reformatting, then I'd have the same problem, right? So there you go. All right. So striping. Talking about striping. A very common misconception, and I get this all the time, is that I only have one backup drive, so striping will do no good whatsoever. As a matter of fact, somebody wrote a blog recently about that and pinged me to proofread it afterwards to say make sure that, and he stressed in there, if you don't have multiple drives, striping will do you no good. Striping does all the good in the world with a single drive. I do this all the time. I've been doing it for 20 years, and I almost never have multiple drives to stripe my backups to. You will get almost as much benefit. As a matter of fact, yeah, going to multiple LUNs, you will get some benefit, but not nearly as much as you would think, and only in the real upper echelons when you're trying to leech every ounce of performance out of it that you can. Going to a single, it's about the number of writers that you have, right? And as long as you're not taxing that disk, as long as you're not causing queuing, right, then keep that disk as busy as you can, especially if it's a dedicated backup disk. You are going to be golden, right? If it's like a LUN attached to that, if it's a LUN attached to that server and not some centralized NAS that everybody's writing to, right? But if it's a dedicated LUN, especially attached to that server, blow it out of the water, man, you know? So, yes, if you have a single Z drive that maps to a backup LUN, don't give any thought at all to backing up, 10 and 15 and 20 files to that one location. You're going to get tons of benefit out of it. And you're going to take your backups from several hours down to just a few minutes. I think the best I've ever done was I backed up a 2 to 2.5 terabyte database, I think, in a little under 20 minutes. And all of that was going to a single drive. There was no special configuration in there. So, right now we've gone to compression and striping. Now, you can blow this out of the water, right? We did, what did we say? How long was it? 39 seconds to back it up last time? Is that what it was? We'll keep it at that. And let's see how we do with this one. And we're backing up to 6 files here. Now, while we're waiting for that, I always like to give the number of file here. And when I teach my backup basics class, even though this is the first time I've spoken, I'm thinking in the future if I ever teach one of these. So when I always teach that, I always like to give the number of files as well. So I'll say something like this. I'll say one of 6, right? And then I'll say 2 of 6, 3 of 6, 4 of 6, 5 of 6, 6 of 6. Because it's one thing to know. There we go. It's one thing to know. See, and that one backed up in 20 seconds. That I've got 6 files, but how many should I have? Right? And that's something else. The people that don't like striping tell me they don't like striping because somebody could come in and delete one of the files out from under them. That's just stupid. If you got one file, somebody can come out and delete it. I mean, if they're going to delete your backup file, they're going to delete it, right? Regardless if it's part of a stripe or if it's a lone backup. That's just asinine. So, I've never understood that reasoning, but I'm throwing as much stuff at you as I can, right? So now I'm going to clear all these. Now, you notice here that I'm also setting the max transfer size. We're going to talk about that in a couple minutes. Let me see if I'm doing, yep, there we go. So we're going to talk about that in a couple minutes, and that's a 2 meg transfer size. You can, transfer size is specified in bytes in 64K chunks. Really? It's specified. I want to say that again to show you how ridiculous Microsoft can be sometimes. You specify it in bytes in 64K chunks. Not 64 byte chunks, but K chunks. You automatically have to do some math in there. You have to take your 64K and turn it into bytes and then multiply it every time, right? So they're always switching units of measure on us. So anyway, this is bytes, so that's a 2 meg transfer size. By default, let me see if I can get this right. By default, any database under 10 gigs gets a 64K max transfer size, and anything over 10 gigs gets 1 meg. I think that's right. So I've increased it to 2. You can go up to 4. I've never found, well, I'm not going to say never. I have found 4 to be useful, but only in extreme network backup scenarios. So let's say that you've got a huge database that you're backing up to a UNC path somewhere across the network, and you've got jumbo frames turned on across the board, usually set to 9 megs, right? Then a max transfer size of 4 megs can really do you some good. I mean, it can be significant for your performance. 2 megs will be better than 1, right? I almost never, once I start tuning, right, I almost never do the 1 meg transfer rate. I almost always do 2. That seems to be my sweet spot. I haven't really bothered going up in 64K chunks to see if there's I don't care, 2 megs or 4 megs, whatever, right? But 4 megs has really only come in handy across really large network backups, and only when you have jumbo frames turned on so that you can handle it. If you can't handle it, if you don't have jumbo frames turned on, then there's no point in having that and having your transfer size set at 2 megs or 4 megs, right? Which brings up a good point. If you turn on jumbo frames, and this is where a lot of people fail, if you turn on jumbo frames, it has to be turned on at every step of the way. So I have to have the source with it on, the client with it on, and guess what? Every router and or firewall in between has to have that turned on as well. If it's turned off at any point, that's going to be the breakdown, and it's going to start chopping them up at that point, and you're just lost everything, right? So you have to work with your network guys. I'm sorry to tell you this. You have to work with your network guys to make sure that it's turned on, and they will lie to you. They'll say, of course it's turned on. Don't worry about it. We got you covered. Check. Make them check. Make them verify. Okay. So I'm going to turn all of these flags off just so I can reset where I was. We're going to come here. We're going to run a backup with 3004, and this time we're going to send it to the client instead of to the log, just so I can show you the kind of stuff that gets sent. And go. Now let's talk about buffer count here for a second while we're waiting for that. Who knows if we'll have time to actually get in there. Now I said max transfer size before will give you some benefit, but not nearly as much as you'd think. Buffer count is where most of your tuning is going to come from. Buffer count and file striping are the biggest bang for your buck when you're tuning. And buffer count is absolutely huge. Now you can get some of this in the log when you get sent. Now you notice this is where you can see everything that it's doing, right? I can see that it's opening the media. I can see that, oh look, it's a full backup, so it's clearing the differential bitmaps. If this were a copy-only backup, it wouldn't clear the diff bitmaps, right? Because it's a copy-only. It doesn't do that. So, and you would see that if this were a log backup, it wouldn't do that either. So that means that a full backup is the only one that clears the diff bitmaps, and that's why it's the differential base, right? So you can see, oh look, it does a checkpoint. So you can see everything that it's doing here along the line. But the problem is what? It doesn't have any timings, so I have no idea how long it took to do anything. So up here, where we sent this to 3605 before, if you add comma 1, because the thing is this goes out and uses multiple streams to do this, so it's not all done in the same SPID, right? So you have to do a global, you have to do a global trace flag for this one if you want to see all of this in the log with timings. You're not going to get a lot out of the log with timings with this, right? And it's going to be interspersed with all the other stuff in the log. This is going to be kind of hard to see. But you can see when it opens the media, when it has, how long it takes to clear the diff bitmaps by looking at the timing of the log. So if you just run this with 3605 and then comma 1, then you'll be able to see all that stuff in the log and you'll get all those streams pulled together. Okay? But I showed you this just so you could see, so you can start investigating some of the stuff that the different types of backups do. But this in and of itself doesn't really do anything for timing, right? It doesn't do anything for tuning at all. Okay, so now back to buffer count. So buffer count is basically the amount of memory that you're going to use when you're taking your backup. And the way the memory is configured, I think I've got this in there somewhere. The way the memory is configured is its max transfer size times the buffer count. And then times, of course, your compression ratio, which we'll also talk about. So more buffers, to put this in nice caveman speak, right? More buffers equal more speed. And also more resource contention too, because now you're using all that memory. And this is, this memory that you use here is, it's not buffer space, so it comes right out of Windows. So whenever you, this is this is another pitfall. When you're setting up your servers, set up tuned backups in your server spec. How much space do we, how much memory do we need for our server? Oh, we need about 12 gigs. Okay, and then your backup hits, and how much memory are you using if you try to tune your backups? Part of that 12 gigs, because it comes out of Windows, which means it's going to steal it from the SQL buffer, right? So now you're going to need probably, if you need 12 gigs, get 24, because nobody ever takes the memory that you need for maintenance into account, right? If you're building a new server and you need 12 gigs for the SQL processes, well then double that, because you still got reindexes, backups, check DBs. You got all these things that use memory, right? And you don't want it to steal it from SQL when it does it. So the more memory you have, the more buffers you can have, the faster your backup's going to go. And I see people way under-tuning their backups. This is probably one of the biggest mistakes they make is I'll get an email invariably a couple weeks afterwards, and they'll say, hey, I tried to tune my backups, and it's a terabyte database, and it did a little bit of good. I started using 2 files, and I used 50 buffers, but it really only increased the speed by like 10 minutes. I really thought it would have done better than that. And I'll write them back and say, you know what? Try 10 or 15 files and 500 or 1,000 buffers. No. Oh my God, really? Yeah. Sometimes you have to really blow it out. Think big when you're doing this, right? Think big. So that brings up a really good story. When I first started doing this, it was I called Lightspeed support because I saw this nice little flag in there. I forget what they call it now, but it's basically the number of buffers or buffer count or something like that, right? And I looked at it and I was like, wow, that's really cool. I wonder what that's for. There was really nothing in there in the help file. It just said, increases the number of buffers. And I was like, that doesn't say anything. So I called them, and after going through a couple escalations, because the first guys didn't know it either, they said, oh, well, you use that to use more buffers, which uses more memory so that you can speed up your backups. I was like, oh, well, that sounds great. So I went in and took my next backup, and it was, this was the late 90s, so it was probably, a couple hundred gig database, right? So I went in there, and I used, and I increased my buffers to 10. I was like, yes, 10 buffers. And my backup went slower. And I was like, thought they said it was supposed to increase it, right? So I called them back and I said, this didn't work at all. And it was actually quite a bit of, and they didn't really know anything about it. So, I went on about my way, right? And it was a while after that where I was talking to somebody else, I forget who I hooked up with, that showed me this trace flag. This trace flag, 3213. This is a very important trace flag when you're tuning, because this is where you're going to live. You will live in 3213. It's like Monsters, Inc., right? 3213, 3213. And what I found, here, as a matter of fact, I'm going to show you this real quick. I'm going to turn on 3213. I'm sending it to the client. As a matter of fact, I want to run this without that buffer count, so I'm going to back it up here instead. There we are. So, and I should get some data back pretty fast from this. It shouldn't take the entire length of the backup to bring back that info. But what I had found was that by default, my database was backing up with like 15 buffers. So I lowered the buffers. So here we are. So here, look, buffer count, 7. Sets of buffers, 3. I was going to say we'll talk about that later, but we need to start talking about this stuff right away. So It uses 7 buffers by default. Why so low? I mean, I've got this set for 50, right? That seems like an awful small amount of buffers. That's because by default, they don't want to affect your user processes. You want to back up, fine, but they're not going to do it at the cost of your business, right? At the cost of people actually in there doing work in the database. So they run this with as few resources as they can get away with, which is why it takes so long. That's just the default, guys. Don't use the default. I hope to hell that you don't keep the model database at its defaults, right? So that every database gets created with 10% growth and 1 meg of growth, right? I hope to hell you guys don't keep that default. No, I sure don't. Would never do that. So don't keep the backup defaults. Now, sets of buffers. It takes different sets of buffers to do the different operations. You're going to have 2 options here, 1 and 3. 1 is uncompressed, 3 is compressed. So it takes them 3 sets of buffers to do everything in the compression that they need to. They take it here, then they move it there, then they move it there, then it finally gets written. So they need 3 sets of buffers. So when you're doing your compressed backups, you're going to take more memory than you do with your uncompressed backups, right? In the neighborhood of 3 times more, right? So because you got 3 complete buffers. And now here is my total buffer space. I'm using 21 megs. 7 times 3, 21. Isn't that cool? Okay. And I've got a bunch of other info here as well, including my max transfer size. And this is below 10 gigs. This database is below 10 gigs. So I've got my 64K max transfer size, right? Or, I'm sorry, that's a meg. So it must be above 10. It must be 10 megs, not 10 gigs. So 64K must be a 10 meg database size. Anything over that is a meg. So something like that. Okay, so you will live here because you have to know what you started with before you know where you can go, or you will end up lowering it. So from here, I'm going to go strictly to 50 now, and with a single file, that's actually pretty good. So, oops, I'm not going to restore. I'm going to back up. Here we are to a single file with 50 buffers. Yep, I've still got that turned on, so now I'm going to do that. And now you'll see that we'll actually take a fairly decent backup even with a single file with 50 buffers. So either one of those will increase the backup pretty well. And then when you put them together, you take it down from several hours down to just a few minutes. And it's all in playing with it, right? You're going to the way it works, you're going to look at your default, and then you're going to, which we need to get into here right away, and then you're going to set some parameters. Say you've got a terabyte database. Well, let's start with, at a terabyte, let's start with 10 files and 500 buffers and see what kind of backup time we get there. Then we'll go to 15 files and 200 buffers, or, oh, wait a minute, we started at 500, didn't we? And go to 700 buffers or 1,000 buffers, right? And see if everything goes right there. And then we'll keep going and we'll mark down all of these times, all of these buffers and max transfer size and number of files, and the write rate, which we'll have here, down at the bottom, processed 269 megs a second, right? That's how you can tell how well you're doing. You're going to reach a saturation when you start taking more and more memory. Let's say that I go from 1,000 buffers to 2,000 buffers, and I only increase this from 269 to 271. Well, that's an awful lot of memory to only get a couple more megs a second out of it, right? That's not really worth it. So you're going to get diminishing returns, right? You don't have to tune it as fast as it can possibly go. Regardless, you're going to spend more time managing buffers and spinning up buffers and whatnot than you are than you're going to actually do work, right? And even when you're doing a restore, nobody cares if it takes an extra 30 seconds, right? Nobody's going to count that into it. So okay, oh yeah, and I got this one before too. I usually throw this in at the end, but I'll do it right now. When doing your restores, it's not a linear It's not a direct comparison. If I use 500 buffers on my backup, my restore may be tuned at 1,000 or 1,500. It may, it's not 500 to 500. So you're not going to use the exact same ones that you use when you back up. It's a completely, the backups and restores have to be tuned separately. Now, if you don't have a chance to tune your restores, then sure, just throw a crap load of those resources at it and restore as fast as you can and move on, right? But you can see that if I don't tune my backups, I can't tune my restores. Sure, if I back up with the default settings and with the default transfer size and the default buffer count, I can restore with any transfer size and buffer count I want, right? But I had to have striped it if I'm going to do a really good job. I can't go back and retroactively stripe it when I'm restoring, right? And the striping, along with the buffer count, is going to be your biggest hit, right? It's not the transfer size. That'll give you some, but not a lot. The striping will do more for you and the buffer count will do more for you than anything else, right? So if you didn't stripe your backup, then your restore is going to be very, very capped regardless of the buffer count and transfer size you use. You can only read from a single file so fast, right? Okay. There's a bunch of this stuff in here. I don't really consider that important right now because this is just a query I pulled off the internet a few years ago that shows you your compression ratio right there, so you can see the percent compression you're getting. Now, let's talk about null backups, because null backups are where it's going to be. So I'm going to take this null backup. Now, a null backup, when you write to a null device, this is an operating system device that basically throws away the write. Okay? It doesn't actually perform the write. So what this gives you is it gives you your theoretical backup speed. My theoretical backup speed here is 442 megs a second. I can't back up any faster than that. Now here's a question for you. If it doesn't actually do the write, then how am I testing the theoretical backup speed? Yeah, because it's testing the read speed. Can you write faster than you can read? No. Right? So if I can see the fastest I can read, then the rest of this is going to be write speed. Right? So this is the fastest I can get. Will I ever reach this theoretical limit? No. Because I do have the write problem on the other side, and I've got buffer stuff in between. I've got overhead, right? But I want to get as close to it as possible without doing what? Without destroying my users. Okay. So there are two ways that you can handle this. You get your backup tuned to the nines, right? I mean, it is as fast as it can go. And you've got this 4 terabyte database backing up in half an hour. And the users call and say, we can't do anything. The servers, everything's timing out. We can't do anything, right? Well, of course, we're DBA, so the first thing we're going to do is say, suck it up for half an hour, right? I got to back up my database fast. And then when the VP calls you and tells you the same thing, you're gonna change your tune and say, okay, well, I'll back it off, right? I had this database a few years ago that I was actually backing up to 25 files and 3,000 buffers. Nobody could even log in. It was great. Oh man, it was great. I didn't have to worry about the full backup backing up the end of the log at the end of it. There was nothing going on. Nobody could do anything. And that's actually not an exaggeration. I actually maxed it out that bad and had to back it off to like 1,000 buffers and like 15 files. And then it was a little bit slow. They could at least work then, right? But you have to know how much you can do because of your restores, right? How many people are going to be in the database while you restore it? None. So it's yours. Max it out. Go for it, right? Get it up as fast as possible. The number of times as a consultant I've come in and seen them, oh God, it's ridiculous, right? And seeing them taking backups before a code push, right? Because they're too stupid to use snapshots. And then making these guys wait 2.5 hours while they back up this huge database. And I come in with just a half-assed tuning effort and bring it down to 20 minutes. And they're like, oh my God, it's backed up already? How did you do that? because I went to SQL school. That's how I did it. I mean, a little bit of simple tuning, right? I mean, not even trying, just, let's throw 1,000 buffers and 15 files at it and see what that does. I mean, it's better than what they're doing now, but they were always doing a single file and making these guys wait 2.5 hours before they'd even start their code push. When even that method is stupid, because you should be using snapshots for stuff like that, right? That's what they're for. Okay, off of my little diatribe. Okay, now, how do you know when... Okay, so back to theoretical limit. So that's your theoretical limit, and you can even test the limit with a buffer count. You can even say 2 disk equals 2 disk equals 2 disk equals 2 disk. So you can even stack those up, right? And it throws that right away. It's beautiful. Now, how do you know when you've gone too far? Well, when your CPU reaches 100%, you're done, right? When you've got your disk read bytes per second, right? That's how fast you're reading it. And you've got your average disk seconds per read, right? So your disk read bytes per second is going to slowly climb, and it's going to level off, right? So it's basically, for the bulk of the operation, it's basically going to be a flat line somewhere on your perfmon graph, right? Notice I said perfmon and not some other jackasinine tool. Perfmon is just fine, guys. Learn how to use it. It'll save you thousands of dollars. So I've got this flat line here, and then I've got disk seconds per read. Well, the more readers I have, the longer it's going to take to read those, right? Because I'm adding more and more and more contention to that disk. So these guys are going to climb, right? When that crosses that line, you're done. Or when the phone rings, you're done. Okay? So, know how you can get up really fast and really high, and then know that you're probably going to have to back off and you'll almost never get to use it. That's fine, right? It's like having that. It's like why guys in the 50s used to carry around switchblades, right? Just in case. Okay, let's see where we are. Okay. I'm going to do a little bit of this, and then I'm going to get into managing this stuff at the enterprise, because I've got 25 minutes. Golden. Okay. Now, let's say that you want to, and I've already got this stuff online. It's going to be online. I was talking to Neil earlier. We're going to turn all this stuff in, and I explain all of this in great detail right here, right? But let's say that you want to hit a target memory limit for your backups. I want to use 10 gigs of RAM for my backups, right? So to do that, look at the memory limit, how it's configured. Okay, I think I have that down here. Okay, here we are. So if you wanted to calculate the number of buffers you would need, because if I want to use 10 gigs, I have to know how many buffers to specify in my backup command to make that happen, right? So in order to make that happen, you start with the formula of the buffer count times the sets of buffers. I'll say that again. Buffer count times sets of buffers, which means you have to know if you're going to take a compressed or an uncompressed backup, right? Times the max transfer size, and that's going to be your memory limit. So it's just a little bit of algebra now to get that turned around, right? So buffer count times the sets of buffers is going to be B, because that's just really going to be the number of buffers that we use. So now I say B times max transfer size equals the memory limit. And now let's say that I want to use 200 megs, 202 megs. That's what I've got specified for my box. Now it's going to be 202 megs. It's going to be B times max transfer size equals 202 megs. So now I switch that around and I say I know my max transfer size. It's going to be 2 megs, right? So now I've got B times 2 megs equals 202. Now I need to change since I've got this in bytes, this is in megs, I need to put this in bytes too. I need to be working from the same unit of measure, right? Unless you work for Microsoft, absolutely. So now I'm going to change my 202 megs into bytes. So now I've got this number of bytes times the max transfer size in bytes times the number of buffers. Now it's just algebra, right? I divide both sides by this, and that gives me B, or 1 times B equals that, and that gives me a buffer count of 101. Right? So now I know if I want to hit that memory limit, I have to specify 101 buffers with a max transfer size of 2 megs. Right? And like I said, this is all written down in excruciating detail all through here. It's really easy to follow. And I've got other sessions where I've recorded this session where I actually went through each one of those, but it's not really necessary. It's simple algebra, really. Okay, now, with that in mind, doing this at the enterprise level, this is where it gets really tough. Because if you've got a lot of servers and you put the time into doing this for your most important servers, but not some of these other servers, and then this one database or this handful of databases you tune really well, and then they grow by 400 gigs or by a terabyte over the next year. Now they're not tuned anymore, and you keep having to go back and do it again and again and again and again, right? Or let's say that you get more resources on the box, or you get fewer resources on the box, and now they're overtuned or undertuned or something like that, right? So that kind of thing is really hard to manage, especially at the enterprise level where you could have, tens of thousands of databases, and you don't have to tune them all to the nines, but it would be nice if they all had some general level of tuning so that you knew they were all being backed up faster than they are now, right? So you got you've got 3 basic problems, right, that we can break down. Number 1 is knowing the resources you're using now. Because we've already said if you don't know the resources you're using, you can't increase them, right? Number 2 is knowing where that sweet spot is going to be, right? Playing with it and knowing where that sweet spot is going to be, which you can see is very manual. I have to take a backup, I have to look at the resources, then I have to take another backup, then you have to kind of play with it like that, right? And number 3 is maintaining it. Right? So you have to maintain that. So if the database gets really big, or if it has an archive routine come in and it shrinks really bad, so if it goes from 200 gigs to 75 gigs, you don't want to obviously use 20 files still. You want to use closer into the 10 range maybe, right? For something like that. So you don't want to use way too many resources for a database that just got archived, right? So it's maintaining it, and databases grow and shrink all the time. Maybe by a lot, maybe by a little. So that's the problem that we're trying to solve, is how to do this in a reasonable fashion that's not going to, I say break the bank, but that's not going to tax you as a DBA team too bad, right? So that's what I built into Minion Backup. And I said we were going to talk about this a little bit because it's free. You download it all day long. I don't even ask you for an email. You just download it and use it, and it's 100% free, and this stuff is built into the tool. Let me show you the kind of stuff that we're doing here. So I'm going to reset my demo just in case. Actually, I need to get into my demo database. I think this is it. There we go. So I'm going to reset that, and I need to reset this too. There we go. Now, I'm not going to get into the entire tool right now because I could talk for half a day on this tool and not cover everything I need to cover, but I'm going to show you the tuning aspect of it. So let's start with the settings path. Do I want to start with path? I don't know why. Oh, yeah, okay. So with settings path, first off, I give you a number of, so Minion default database means everybody. So unless you have an individual database override, this is going to cover everybody. All backup types, this is the backup location. This is the retention period that I'm going to give it. So I want backups that go to this drive to be kept on retention for 24 hours, and every single drive can have a different retention. So if I mirror to a different drive, or if I copy it to a different drive, which you can also do, then they can all have their own retention periods, right? Without any extra jobs too, by the way, right? Everything I show you today is without any extra jobs. So, okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and run this and see where that puts me. Oh, yeah, I know where it puts me. So here, there we go. So now if I come here, I've got 2 different rows. One is going to local C drive, and the other one is going to null. So remember, the first problem we had is finding out how many resources we're using, right? And you notice how both of these are active right now. Well, I want to set that first row to inactive so that I can take a null backup. So now I'm going to set this one, I'm going to turn off the regular row, and I'm going to set it equal to, and now you can see that only the second row is active. So now I'm going to be backing up to a null device instead of to local. So now and you can see this is my statement generator. So now when I do this, you can see it's backing up to null. Now, when I actually run that backup, let's see, which one am I using here? I'm backing up 3 different databases. Okay, good. So I'm going to show you how easy it is to do this against 3 databases instead of just 1 database at a time that we had to do when we did it manually. And it'll take a few seconds. And maybe, if I'm lucky, I can pull this into another window here and see what we've got so far. So far, you can see that I get all my information here, what percentage complete it is and whatnot, and I'm only looking at this one right now until that other one finishes. But look, I've got the backup time, the megs per second, I've got the number of files, I've got the buffer count, I've got the max transfer size, I've got the memory limit. What I do, I've got the sets of buffers. I pull everything out of that 2313 trace flag and I put it in the log table for you. So now, okay, that's done. So now you can see I've got all that stuff for every single one of them. Megs per second for all of them. I've got number of files, I've got buffer count, I've got max transfer size for all of them, memory limit, total buffer space, sets of buffers, all of that stuff, right? So that's with my null backup. So now on all of my servers, I could easily push out a data row in there and take a null backup for all of my servers and know where they start and know where I'm starting from default, right? Now that I have that theoretical limit done, I'm going to delete everything from here just in case. Nope, good. So now let's look at the tuning thresholds, and I think we're going to turn that other row back on here. Yep, we're going to turn that other row back on here in a minute. So now the tuning thresholds come in, and this is where it gets really cool. Because remember, minion default means everybody. So all databases, all backup types. How am I going to configure the space? I'm going to add up all of the data in index space, right? I give you 3 different ways to calculate the space. This is just the best. The measure is going to be a gig. The threshold is a 0, so anything over 0 gigs, right, is going to use 1 file and then the default buffer count and compression settings and block size and all of that, right? But I'm going to turn around and say now, add these rows, and say, now if it's over 3 gigs, between 3 and 5, I want you to use 4 files and 100 buffers and a transfer size of 2. If it's over 5, I want you to use 6 files and 200 buffers. If it's over 10, I want you to use 10 and 400. If it's over 50, I want you to use 15 and 500. So now you can set these groups of sizes, right? Between this size and this size, I want to use these. Between that size and that size, I want to use these. So now as your databases grow and shrink, you're going to get the proper tuning thresholds that you set, right? That's why we call it dynamic tuning in the tool. So, and this is for the default. Let me show you what that looks like. Here's my statement generator again. So what did we have in the log last time? It used 7 buffers, didn't it? Right? Used 7 buffers. So now I pass in the size to this guy. Actually, let's do this. Let's do that. So I'm going to use 4 megs because I happen to know that my that database is about 4 gigs. So now when I pass that in, I'm using 4 files. I get 1 row per file. And how many buffers am I going to use? I'm using, there's my 100, there's my max transfer size. So I'm using 4 files, 100 buffers, and a 2 meg transfer size that I told it to. And the same thing for this one, 125 gigs, and it's going to use 15 files and 500 buffers, and then there's my max transfer size. So it works. Now I'm going to switch these, and I'm going to take a real backup with it. So now I'm going to turn that first row back on and that second row back off. There we go. So I'm going to take a real backup with those 3 databases. And we're going to watch as this comes through. So these guys are all in queue right now. And the reason this came with warnings, by the way, is because I pull all of the header information for all of your backup files and store it in the backup files table. So you can easily crawl through all of the LSNs and all the other information in your header. And since I didn't write a header because I took a null backup, it couldn't get that information. So this feature only came in this last round. So the null backups. So what I'm going to do in this next round is I'm going to say, if it's null, don't even try to get the header information, and it'll take that out. But for right now, just know that that's what it does, right? So here we are. They're all complete. And now you can see the megs per second that they used. And you can see the buffer count. And you can see the max transfer size of this one that was blown out of the water. So it definitely happened, right? And now, to make that even cooler, I can see for a specific database even, if I write this query like this, I can see my null baseline and my backup, and I can see I don't have a backup size because it didn't write the file. But I can see my megs per second. Now look, this is interesting. I went from 15 seconds to 17 seconds and 318 megs a second to 279 megs a second. So from the baseline to the real backup, it actually got worse, right? Why is that? Yeah. Exactly, right? So that can be confusing. You say, well, I'm getting worse. Of course you're getting worse. You got to build up to it, right? So, so I'm using 4 files and 100 buffers here. I could probably use 8 files and 200 buffers, but on something like this, you're only going to get so much, that diminishing returns, right? So I probably won't get much better if I go any faster than that. But look how much easier that makes your tuning effort. And you could turn these things on. You could push these rows out to tens of thousands of databases using any method you want. SIS if you want to. I don't care. And you could have a level of tuning for your entire environment, and then turn around and only manually tune your top 3 or 4 databases that everybody cares about, right? But now you're at least going to have some level of tuning to your entire environment. And I've written a query, really, where you can look at the resources that are on the box. You can say, if the box has this much RAM and this many CPUs, then use this much, then use these buffers and this transfer account. If it's got this, then use that. If it's got that, then use that. So now you can even have a dynamic query with the case statement, right? That when it connects to when it runs on each one of those boxes, it knows the resources, and then it sets it up based on what you have, right? So it's really nifty to be able to do something like that across tens of thousands of databases in just a couple minutes, and now you've got an enterprise management system for your, or a way to manage your enterprise tuning, because that's the bad part about tuning, right? It's the same thing as index tuning, right? You go to a session, you see this really cool thing on tuning your indexes, and you go back home and you go, I've got 40,000 databases. What the hell, right? How are you going to make that happen? You're going to make it happen for the top 2 or 3 databases in your shop, and then the rest of them are never, ever, ever going to happen. Oh, sure, you always mean to, right? And the thing is you don't really know how long, you don't really know how bad some of these things are out of tune, right? So, all right, so let's see. Let's test it with another setting. Okay, so I do have that in here to test it with with 8 and 200, but that actually performs worse. So that's a product of overtuning again. So let's see here. Where was I? Oh yeah. So what I wanted to show you here was being able to set just a database override and show you what that looks like. So I've got my minion default. So every database is going to use these settings except this database. It's going to use its own settings for all of these, for all the backup types. So does that mean I could set different settings for my logs as I do for my fulls? Absolutely, right? And it's smart enough to look at the size of the log and not the size of the database. So if it's a log backup, then it's going to say, oh, if the log itself is over 50 gigs, then use this many parameters. And why is that important, right? If you're backing up your logs every 15 minutes and you get a process that comes and blows your log out to 50 gigs or 90 gigs or even 30 gigs, that's not going to be backed up in 15 minutes. So all the other databases that are expecting a backup every 15 minutes are now going to fail, or they're not going to fail. They're going to be pushed way behind, right? Because it's going to take this one database so long to back up its log. But if you tune your logs as well and say, especially for these databases that you know that have it, right? If this thing is over 20 gigs or if it's over 30 gigs or something, use 6 files or 10 files or 15 files and really blow that log backup out of the water, you're going to be a lot more able to stay on schedule with the rest of your backups as well, right? So there's a lot of play and a lot of tuning in here that you can do. Now, and just to show you this guy right here, gets 7, whereas DB stats, I don't know how many DB stats is supposed to get, gets 15. So you can see they're definitely getting different values, right? So it's not just that, but let me pull this guy in here and see what I'm supposed to be showing you there. Let's see what I'm supposed to be showing you with this one. Maybe this is just another specific one. Okay, so this is just the same. This is a daily. Now, here in the day of week, you can also set different times. You can set different parameters for the different days. So I can say daily, which is every day, I want to use these parameters. But you can also say on the weekends, I want to use these parameters. Or on weekdays, I want to use these parameters. Right? So I can even say, like, for my normal operations where everything is, where I've got a lot of users, I want to use, say, 10 files and 500 buffers. But on the weekends, when we don't have any business, let's use 25 files and 1,000 buffers. And let's get that backup done. Right? And you don't have to sit there and manage that thing back and forth. Right? As well, let me see, it's this one right here. I can even say, and I think you'll agree, we really blew this feature out of the water, right? You can even say that not only do I want it to have these parameters daily, but on Tuesday between 9 and 2, I want it to use these parameters. So every single day between 9 and 2, I want it to use these parameters. But on Tuesday especially, maybe I want to use more, maybe I want to use fewer, right? But I can even take it down to the time of the day on a specific day, every single day, or on a weekday between these guys, between this time and this time, I'm really busy, so back it off. So this would really come in handy, not necessarily for fulls, because you're not really going to take a full during that time, right? But if you have a log backup, and it gets blown all the way out during that busy time, you can say, I want you to only use half the parameters you would ordinarily use because this is our really busy time, right? So this is more made for toning it down than it is for ratcheting it up. But you can easily use it to ratchet up too, right? So that's our dynamic tuning feature. And you can see that all of that, let me see if I can get back up here. Should be up here somewhere. Get lost in all the stuff. Where did it go? Right here. Oh, it's even in the other window too. But you can see that it's fully logged as well. We give you so much stuff in the log, including when you take a log backup, we give you the size of the log, we give you the log reuse weight description. We actually give you the size of the log before and after the log backup. And I give you the number of VLFs before the log backup in the log. So this log table has absolutely everything in it that you would ever want. I'm looking for VLFs. It's in there somewhere, probably here closer to the end. It's in there somewhere. Yeah, I don't know. I passed it somewhere. And I don't have a log backup right now, so I can't show you the number of VLFs, but the column is there. Yeah, I don't know. It's in there somewhere. But I give you the compression ratio and the compression percent, so you can see how much compression you're getting. and I even give you the size of the files. I give you absolutely everything, and there you go. That is not only tuning your backups, but also I'm giving you a backup routine that you can use to actually manage it at an enterprise level, so it's not so daunting. That's all I have. Hey, I finished on time this time. There you go. I'm done, guys.